Tonight we're going to discuss a book published in 1940 by Gertrude Stein called Ida. The book seems to be a relatively small book. I'm going to explain exactly why. A whole lifetime of experience can be compressed into 154 pages of relatively large type. The book seems to be a narrative of the life of a woman by the name of Ida. It gives us more or less a commonplace life. But we'll discover, in fact, that the book is a monument of information, a mine of information about government, religion, economics, art and aesthetics, science and technology, education, and social behavior. The book was published by Gertrude Stein, a woman who was born in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, February 3rd, 1874. She and her famous brother Leo was born 2 years before Gertrude, died 1 year afterwards. Allegheny, Pennsylvania is north side of Pittsburgh today, and she isn't probably far, or her home isn't very far from Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. When she was quite young, Gertrude Stein's family moved to Austria and then to France. They were the progeny of immigrants in the late 1860s or 1870s who seemed to build a fortune in clothing. And after her father died, her brother further built the fortune so that Gertrude Stein and her family had no economic worries throughout their lifetime, although in World War II she was threadbare only because she was in France during World War II, and we'll see about that. Gertrude Stein was a large woman. At the age of 16, she weighed 135 pounds, and she hired a boy to box with her to help her lose weight. Kind of interesting situation. In 1879, the family moved to Baltimore, and then in 1880, they moved to Oakland, California. Very mobile, and I think you'll find that in Ida, the positioning from one place to another seems characteristic of Gertrude Stone's own family situation, where she was moved from one place to the other. But in 1891, her father died of a heart attack. 1 year before her brother enrolled in Harvard University to study history and then moved on to Johns Hopkins for biology. I've interspersed into this account some of the presidents of the United States so we get some idea where they are historically. Gertrude Stein herself enrolled in Harvard in 1894, which was called the Harvard Annex, which a year later became Radcliffe College. She was a student of William James in the Harvard Psychological Laboratory and published in a scientific journal on an article entitled Normal Motor Automatism. 1 year later, William McKinley became president. She enrolled in Johns Hopkins Medical School, failed 4 courses. It didn't seem to interest her, and she left We'll see exactly where she went. Some of the events of these early years: she left a dental school in 1897 at a time when there was an artistic ferment in Europe, Cubism, involving a number of major writers whom she was to meet when she and her brother moved to France, including the works of Cézanne, Matisse, and Picasso. From 1901 to 1909, Theodore Roosevelt was president during these years. In 1902, rayon was discovered, patented, and invented by Little, Walker, and York, just to give you some framework of what was happening. But by 1903, she had made her mark by becoming essentially an expatriate, spending most of her life then in France, overseas. In 1903, she moved to an apartment with her brother Leon Stein, who himself was an art connoisseur and a connoisseur in furniture, particularly Renaissance furniture. But he was also interested in Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso, and others. Got to get that right. Michael Stein, one of her brother, also moved to Europe, and the sister, who was the daughter of a rabbi, became a Christian Scientist. Leo himself lost interest in Picasso around 1912, and he turned over all of his Picasso interests to Gertrude. In 1905, she met Picasso and poses for Picasso in 1906. And we're going to talk a little bit about Picasso because I think he gives us very keen insight into the way she writes and into the kind of writing she has done, so that this little book called Ida becomes a much more massive volume when you realize how the minimalist philosophy fleshes out into a whole program of life's understanding. We'll get into that in a few moments. In 1906, Stein went to San Francisco and showed Matisse. She was one of the first people to interest scholars and public in Matisse. And in 1907, she met Alice B. Toklas, the woman she was to live with the rest of her life. Alice Toklas always staying in the background. One of the works that Gertrude Stein wrote is the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. But actually, it's not the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. It's the autobiography of Gertrude Stein in the guise of Alice B. Toklas. A few points about what she has done. Some of her famous titles that you ought to know. In 1909, she began writing The Making of Americans, which is a much more extended document than Ida, and the one which imprints upon us the impressionistic career of the authors and the writers and the minimalist art that they were advancing through cubistic, primitivistic, and other types of art. 1914, she wrote Tender Buttons. And I'm always tempted to go into a number of these works and discuss them, but our job today is to discuss one book, and that is Ida. A few details. Stein and Toklas toured and lived in Spain in 1915. In 1917, World War I came. The first American combat troops landed in France April 6th. Again, what we're doing is giving the milieu, the lifespan of Alice B. Toklas, understanding, of course, that she lived through 2 world wars, lived to see the beginning of the Russian Revolution, lived to see the activities of Spain, and was among those writers, including Hemingway, who took part in these political experiences that made the 20th century so much oriented in a way that the early writers found themselves very much involved in the political events. 1917, the Russian Revolution began. At this time, the World War I was underway, and Stein and Toklas worked for the American Fund for the French Wounded. In 1921, they met Sherwood Anderson, among the writers. In 1922, she meets young Ernest Hemingway, who wrote most of his major books prior to the one we're reading tonight, Ida. The interesting thing, of course, is that nothing that any of these writers has written, Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, others she has met, really gives us any hint or understanding of the way she herself writes. And I think it's rather interesting to note that she is an original writer, a unique writer. I don't think that we have anyone who has imitated her as a prose writer, emulated her, or tried to pattern themselves again after her. She is original, she is unique, and we're going to study her in that light. In 1926, her writing had become famous, and she began to lecture at Oxford and Cambridge. In 1929, she rented a residence in Berlin in France, while in Germany, Hitler had come to power and Europe was becoming restive. Spain became a republic in 1931, ending the Bourbon throne. And in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, who was president until her death. In 1933, the year Roosevelt comes to office, she writes the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, and another book, Matisse, Picasso, and Gertrude Stein, with 2 shorter stories. She was a playwright, a poet. Of course, everyone knows her most famous line, "A rose is a rose is a rose is a rose." 4 roses. And that came out of one of her plays. In 1939, World War II began, and Stein and Toklas found themselves in Billingen and Culos during World War II, during the German occupation. She actually lived in the country. And in World War II in France, there were actually 2 characterizations of France. One was occupied France, which was Paris and major strategic areas held by the Germans. The other was unoccupied France, still under the control of the Germans, but a world apart from France itself. From occupied France, from Vichy France. Although we know that Gertrude Stein politically supported the Pétain government, the Vichy government. To some, this would be a terrible, terrible political act. But she felt that Pétain knew how to preserve France. And the biographers tell that Germany had a plan. They were going to take quite a bit of time to invade France and then move on to England. When they discovered that France capitulated almost instantly, their timetable was set off, one of the biographers tells us, and they began instantly to prepare for England, but they couldn't bring in enough armaments. They couldn't prepare fast enough to counter America's input and America's aid to England, so that by the time the Germans were ready to attack England, their attack was premature and they weren't able to move on to some. By 1943, of course, it was quite clear, or it's clear to many, that Germany's the war was Germany's at that point to lose. But where was Gertrude Stein and where was Alice Toklas? Germany invaded France May 10th, 1940. And in 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. 41 is also the year that Ida was written. And it's an amazingly non-political work, considering all that was going about her. But it's a work that, to some extent, as she does in so much of her writing, enable her to divorce herself from her personal life and public events. In other words, many of the, at least Ida, I think, in a lot of ways, is a way to separate herself from her real life and to give us a tale of some import, but one that objectifies and allows her to stand away from what her life was. There's an interesting story about how her life was saved in Culos. The Germans, by 1943, were asking the French to record all the names of the Jews in France. In Culos, people knew Gertrude Stein's background. And what they did was ask her for proof that she was a Jewess. Well, no one carries proof around like that. And when they asked her for the proof, she said she didn't have it. And they said, go away. Without proof, we can't record your name. So she wasn't listed on the rolls. And her life and both the life of Alice Toklas was saved in that way. By 1944, you had D-Day. And the invasion of Normandy. August 25th, 1944, Paris was liberated. And 1 year, April 12th, 45, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. Harry Truman became president. And on May 7, 1945, the world experienced the unconditional surrender of Germany. August 6th, the A-bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And August 14, 1945, you had the official surrender of Japan, while September 2nd, 1945 is essentially VJ Day, the day that Japan signed the surrender terms. In 1945, Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas returned to Paris. 1 year later, July 27th, 1946, Gertrude Stein died. She died of cancer. Her last words were, "What is the answer?" Paused for a moment. Then, what is the question? And apparently with a laugh, her niece tells us, Alice B. Toklas followed her almost 21 years later in 1967, buried at the same site in France. The manuscripts of Gertrude Stein are found at Yale University, and people who want to do research into this woman and her life can find the Yale materials. Here's a book that we have in our library called Gertrude Stein Lectures in America. And you have a picture of her there, a portrait of her in this book, when she toured America and gave lectures. And by the time she ended her life, she was one of the most famous writers in the world, an American expatriate, but one whose writing is somewhat difficult to understand, someone whose writing requires interpretation, and someone whom we're going to spend a considerable amount of time tonight trying to interpret. In 1971, her complete collection of modern art was sold to the Museum of Modern Art for $3.5 million. One understands how priceless this art must be today. In fact, she was collecting art in the same time frame as Mrs. de Menil in Houston, who has built the Menil Museum and whose art parallels and characterizes the kind of art that the modern art that both the Rockefellers in New York and Gertrude Stein in Paris was gathering. A unique life, a unique woman, a person whom we can analyze in all kinds of ways. And there are some books worth looking at that you might want to think about. One of them is Marion de Koven's book, A Different Language, Gertrude Stein's Experimental Writing, which appeared in 1983. Gertrude Stein and Modern Painting Beyond Literary Cubism appeared in a magazine called Contemporary Literature in 1981. I'm going to spend a little bit of time tonight looking at Elizabeth Pfeiffer's book, Rescued Readings, a reconstruction of Gertrude Stein's difficult texts. Now, Elizabeth Pfeiffer does not deal with Ida. In fact, very few people have dealt with Ida. And those who have dealt with Ida have dealt it in such meager fashion that I think your comments and your insights tonight may give us more about the content and information about Ida than we've had in any text you can read. Now, I wonder if we haven't had communication in the last 2 weeks with West Houston or North Houston. I received a phone call from Mr. Keach saying he's there. Do I hear from you this time? He said he was frustrated because he heard me saying, "Are you there?" And he was trying to respond, but no voice came. So we may still be having communication problems. Mello's book, Charmed Circle, Gertrude Stein and Company, is the book from which I've got the information about her protection in Culos in France during World War II. And it has a great many anecdotes that may interest you in Gertrude Stein. Cynthia Secor is one of the writers who's tried to deal with Ida. We have an essay called Gertrude Stein, The Complex Force of Her Femininity, which appeared in 1982 by Rutgers University Press, and a rather short but informative article called Ida, a Great American Novel in 20th Century Literature, which appeared in 1978. Blanche Wheaton's book gives us some insight. It's called Women Alone Stir My Imagination, Lesbianism and the Cultural Tradition, appearing in a magazine called Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society in 1979, a fairly early study, and there have been a lot of studies since then which may be of some purpose in our study. Gertrude Stein was an independent woman, and as you'll see from her novel, she does strike a lot of unique and independent ideas. One of the problems in reading Gertrude Stein is the way she writes. Gertrude Stein does not believe in commas. She says that commas interrupt us. I don't have the exact quote in front of me. I copied it down before I came and have been looking for it. But Gertrude Stein says that commas intrude upon our thinking and keep us from stretching our imagination because they make us stop and they make us halt and they make us contemplate what we're doing. So we've been through a half an hour of this lecture, and I think it's about time to just read one page of Gertrude Stein before I go on to discuss her style. And I'm going to discuss her style in two ways. I'm going to, number one, discuss what others have said about her style and some of the meaningful quotations that I think you should think about in terms of utilizing a vocabulary that can deal with her art, with her prose art. And the second thing I'm going to do is show you some Picasso prints that I think will reveal more than anything else what Gertrude Stein does in this very little book. What I'm going to do is turn to page 49, part 3. Ida did not get married, so that never again would she be alone. As a matter of fact, until the third time she was married, she would not be married long. This is on page 49 of this book. I'll repeat it again. Ida did not get married, so that never again would she be alone. As a matter of fact, until the third time she was married, she would not be married long. So the third marriage seems to be a longer marriage. This first time she was married, her husband came from Montana. He was the kind that when he was not alone, he would look thoughtful. He was the kind that knew that in Montana there are mountains, and the mountains have snow on them. He was not born in Montana. He had not lived very long in Montana. He would leave Montana. He had to marry Ida, and he was very thoughtful. Ida, he said, and then he sighed. Oh, Ida, he said. How often, he said, how often have I said, oh, Ida? He was careful. He began to count. He counted the number of times he said, oh, Ida. It is not easy to count, said he to himself, because when I count, I lose count. Oh dear, he said, it is lovely in Montana. There are mountains in Montana, and the mountains are very high, and just then he looked up, and he saw them, and he decided, it was not very sudden, he decided he would never see Montana again, and he never did. He went away from Montana and he went to Virginia. There he saw trees and he was so pleased. He said, I wonder if Ida has ever seen these trees. Of course she had. It was not she who was blind. It was her dog Iris. Suddenly we get a new story. Now the question is, what are the thoughts being expressed on these pages? They seem very simple. They seem almost bland. They seem non-committal. They certainly aren't descriptive. You don't see the mountains yourself. You don't see his facial features. You don't see his jutting jaw, his square features, his aquiline nose, his piercing eyes, his dark eyebrows, his black hair, his disheveled appearance. You see nothing like that. All you see is this man from Montana who responds to Ida in meaningful ways, but mostly in deprecating ways. Oh, Ida, as though what she's saying isn't important. Funnily enough, even if Ida did see trees, she always looked to the ground to see what had fallen from the trees. Leaves might, and nuts, and even feathers and flowers. Even water could fall from a tree. When it did, well, there was her umbrella. She had a very pretty short umbrella. She had lost two, and now she had the third. Her husband said, "Oh, Ida." Now what you have is a woman whose husband, like her, observes nature, but she seems even more perceptive than he. She looks at what the trees represent, what fruit has fallen from them. She looks at the birds that may have been in them. She sees the flower growing. She doesn't mind the outdoors. She has her umbrella, even though at some point she's been absent-minded, left two umbrellas somewhere where she hasn't found them. And her husband, recognizing that either she's absent-minded or that she's pleased to be in the forest by herself, will just simply say, "Oh, Ida." Now we're going to go over these passages, but it seems simple, and yet in this simplicity there's a monument of experiences between a husband and wife. There's a monumental set of experiences dealing with a person who's left home and knows he's never going to return. There is an interaction between the husband and wife knowing that they're mobile and that wherever they've been, their home is not a stasis, but is displaced. And one of the characteristics of Ida is that she is displaced. But so was Gertrude Stein. And Gertrude Stein, we may say, was displaced geographically. Because her father and mother died when she was quite young, she may have been displaced familially. Certainly in her social and sexual life, she is not traditional, and she may have felt there then that she was more displaced than ever. And so we begin to discover that these little passages, these simple passages, take on a much broader experience. Now, Elizabeth Pfeiffer in Rescued Readings makes these statements. And I want to record them because as we begin talking tonight, these are some of the principles that you would want to identify when we start discussing this novel in its complexity and in its reaches. One of the statements you see is Gertrude Stein forges new possibilities for both masculine and feminine identities. We're already aware that she wants to maintain her identity with her husband. Very often in this novel, she doesn't want to be oppressed or suppressed or deterred by her husbands. She wants to have her independence. She wants to know them, and she wants them to know her. And we'll see how that develops. Secondly, her style. Says Elizabeth Pfeiffer, Gertrude's style is assertively non-linear, non-logical, and unconfined to its textual mooring. What does that mean? What does that mean? It's non-linear. That means it's associational. She's admiring the trees in Montana, or her husband is admiring the trees outside of Montana. Then she sees fruits under the trees. not associated with the trees, but not of the trees themselves. And then she raises her umbrella and thinks about the umbrella she has lost. So it's non-linear. There's no need for one event to progress after another. And we'll see how this works in certain other passages. She's non-logical and unconfined. We're not looking for logical details. Okay. Pfeiffer says that Gertrude Stein's future relations, both homosexual and literary, would prove to be as full of complexities, contradictions, and complications as was her previous relationship with her brother Leo Stein. Leo lived with her in France originally. When she moved in with Gertrude with the Aristocles, Leo moved out. At times she was alienated from Leo, and at times they were close together. But this passage, the books are full of complexities, contradictions, and complications. And one of the problems with Ida is that you've got to reconcile yourself to the complexities, the contradictions, and the complications. Pfeiffer says that sex is presented as being not merely potentially scandalous, it is seen as dirty, as polluting. I think that Ida in 1940 is far from this particular experience. I think by 1940, Gertrude Stein, in fact, gives us a number of relationships in which there is a desirable relationship between two people, which does not suggest this. But I do believe it's true what she says here, that sex must be simultaneously praised and valorized. Now, valorize means to give value to something. It's one of the jargon, one of the words in the current critical jargon that seems to be worth using. Sex must simultaneously be praised and valorized as the artist's energizing subject, indeed the subject of all creativity. And whenever you find the relationships between Ida and her various husbands, there is always the assumption that there is a sexual energizing here that values, elaborates upon, celebrates, and hopes to sustain a sexual orientation. Again, it's not necessary for a writer to be writing about anything other than what life is about. Some of it is autobiographical, some of it is biographical, some of it is fictional, but all of it deals with essential behavior. And the essential behavior of Ida, and the essential behavior of Ida in conjunction with all the people she meets, suggests a common ground of understanding for people who are going to survive in this world. Sexuality, according to Pfeiffer in her book called Rescued Readings, is a source of creative self-expression and pride, but it also continues to constitute a threat. I saw a movie recently, A Circle of Friends, about Ireland, a love affair. Did anyone see it here? You read the book? It's worth seeing. you could go to that movie and say the exact same thing, that sexuality is a source of creative self-expression and pride, but it also continues to constitute a threat. A few more ideas about style, and I think as you begin looking at these terms, they become very, very useful in helping us to understand what's happening in Ida. Her plays, this doesn't appeal, as I said, Pfeiffer does not deal with Ida. Few writers deal with Ida. You're going to be spending more time with Ida tonight than most critics have done in a lifetime. And perhaps at that point you'll find how important this book is and how unique it is. Her works, in this case her plays, comprise a synesthesia. Synesthesia is the synthesis of impressions. A synesthesia of food, clothing, and sensuality, body, and house parts. And so when you begin looking at this work and seeing how much really is involved, you're going to find that the world, that her works comprise a synesthesia of food, clothing, and sensuality, body, and house parts. Pfeiffer makes this statement, which is possibly applicable to Ida. Romantic love has to do mostly with aggression, with who holds power in the relationship. Love itself appears splintered into all its guises, from the mockingly bland to the profoundly sincere, and even lachrymose. Lachrymose meaning tears. So if romantic love has to do with aggression and who holds power, then a number of these situations that we find in Ida are intended to show shared power. When a husband leaves or when Ida leaves, it's a single decision. And when they're together, there is a conscious effort to have them doing the same things. In other words, what Gertrude Stein is trying to promote is an equality of man and woman, husband and wife, lovers together without one being dominant and one being suppressed. It's a very difficult thing to do, but she attempts it. Stein says, Pfeiffer urges women to infuse their behavior with a vigor and dominance characteristically thought of as being male. In other words, she's looking to give women equal strength. Now, a few more ideas. In terms of style, things seem very innocent, but says Pfeiffer, an important subterfuge of Stein's is the use of the impersonal it or that to replace vagina or intercourse or to refer to other sexual ideas. Her bohemian impulses are balanced by a streak of the puritanical. And I think we do find that in Ida, that there are protocols, there are reservations. The most passionate scenes are told in the most impassioned ways. The excitement of relationships is totally subverted by an objectification which expresses emotion not at all. There's an intense reversal of the feelings one might expect. But once you understand that the reversal is the antithesis of what happens, then the objective moment becomes, in your mind, or in anyone's mind who has experienced love, an understanding of what Ida is trying to tell us. Now that may seem odd to say that what seems not to be a passionate moment ought to be viewed that way. But I think once you know the formulas and once you know the codes, you can deal with this book in the way it should be dealt with. Just a few more points of style, and then we'll move on. Stein uses an indirect method to prod her unconscious mind. An indirect method. She uses techniques, and you can write these down if you want to, balance, block, or modify a statement. She will balance, block, or modify a statement. And as you go through this book, ask yourself, what does this balance achieve? What does this blocking detail achieve? This is a passage that comes from psychoanalytic books. That Stein uses a free recall method. She tries to be unselective. She creates a word salad. The term word salad actually comes from a psychoanalytic text. Elaine Chaika, Chaika, in a magazine called Brain and Language, has written a discussion of word associations, and she calls it word salads. Throw in the onions, throw in the tomatoes, put in some lettuce, put in some radishes, put in some onions, mix them up, put some sauce on them, and you have yourself a salad. Well, that's what you get when you look at a page of Ida. Word salads. And when they all come together and they congeal, they ought to taste good. Or at least you ought to understand, by your taste, what meaning they have. You move from word salads to what Pfeiffer calls a shower of words. A shower of words. Stein's syntax produces a shower of words. Now, that essentially is one of the points I'd like to make about syntax. Now, I want to make another point about art. If you were to walk into the Museum of Modern Art, you would see a Picasso that looks something like this. There's a bull, and there's the bull's body, and there's the bull's tail, and here's the bull's leg, and here's the underside of the body, and we move on. And this is a Picasso bull. Now, it's not quite, Picasso draws a little better. A bull has horns. A bull also has a recognizable genitalia. Now, you walk in your museum and you look at this bull drawn on a Picasso plate, on a lithograph. And you say to yourself, my kid could have done that. And I liken Ida to this bull because what you have is the most simplistic element of the definitions of bullality. I don't know if there's such a word as bullality, but I'm going to use it. The horns, masculinity, the force of the body, the genitalia for reproduction, and that has to be the bull. That's what Picasso drew. And this is in a book called A Handbook of Graphic Reproduction Processes. Now, what I want you to know, however, is that it may be that a child could have drawn this. But this is the 11th state of a series of plates that Picasso drew, and this is the end state. Let me show you where Picasso began. Before he reached that state, Picasso had given us another type of bull. I'm going to try to give you that. And then we'll go back. What Picasso had done was to give us the bull, okay. You're getting more of a cubistic bull here. That's the sixth state of this bull drawing in Picasso's handling. So you go back 6 stages to that sixth state, because as Picasso began pulling, I'm going backwards now. This is what Picasso gave us by the sixth plate. But I want to show you where Picasso began. Start building the musculature. What Picasso gives us in the first stage, and I'm not an artist by any means, but he gives us essentially a full bull. Now, this was the second state of these lithographs. So what in fact you have was Picasso starting with a bull with full musculature, absolutely full musculature. Then he switched as he began pulling these plates. You see, this bull was drawn on a soapstone. And as he began pulling plates, the lines of definition began to change. You know, when you pull plates, you can get about 150 pulls from a single design. But if you get the first plate, you got a very heavy plate. If you get the 53rd plate, you get a fairly good plate. If you start getting the 126th of 150 plates, you don't have as distinctive images as you had earlier. And as these pools occurred on these plates, Picasso began to create different states of the plates. And so he redesigned that bull. He said, I don't need all those muscles. All I need is a face, a horns, some muscle appearance, and of course the genitalia. And then he said, this is all I need to tell you what a bull is about. This is all I need to tell you what a bull is about. Now, that I think is exactly what's happening in Ida. And I'm going to show you in a few moments what is there. Because what you get in Ida is this minimalistic drawing of a bull. But what you get in Ida is a fully drawn composition of a woman's experiences in life who is trying to maintain her power and her identity in a masculine world where, paired up in traditional relationships, she is going to sustain her rights and her husband's rights and create equals, which is not the only thing about which this book deals, or the only thing that this book is concerned with. So what we're going to look at when we look at Ida is a minimalist fiction. But what we're dealing with is a great set of materials that will help us understand what the book is about. In order to do that, I'm going to look at one of the Greases. I'd mentioned to you at some point that a good book helps us understand the nature of government. It gives us some idea about religion. It helps us understand economics. We are given insight into the art and aesthetics of civilization. We understand the education of the author and of the reader who is familiar with materials the author is dealing with. Oh, I missed one in here. Science and technology becomes an interesting retrospective. GREASE, and then social behavior becomes another area. So that as we begin studying Ida, we begin looking at the government, the religion, economics, art and aesthetics, science and technology, education, and social behavior. Now, those of you who are watching this on TV, those of you who are watching in the outlying institutes, you don't have in front of you a handout that you will receive in the mail. What's going to happen is when you send me your research papers, I'm going to send this back to you. But this is a document that I've developed. You have some 15 pages of an outline of what I think is in Ida. It's not what I think is in Ida, it is what is in Ida. Divided by the Greases. And I'd like to take a few moments to just look at one of them. Those of you who are in the television audience and watching this are at a disadvantage because you don't have this. but you will have it certainly prior to the final examination. I'm not asking you to learn 15 pages of Ida, but it certainly is worth spending time with. I want to turn to the subject of Ida called religion. And let's try to find out what Ida thinks about religion in this book. And what I've done here is indicate the passage, and I've also indicated the page number in which you're going to find this particular discussion. On page 117, on section 1, page 17, we get an interesting statement. Ida says she was getting to be older. Sometimes she thought about her husband, but she knew that a husband meant marriage, and a marriage meant changes, and changes meant names. And after all, she had so many changes, but she did have just one name, Ida, and she liked it to stay with her. And then she meets someone. On page 17, we discover that she was walking with her dog Love. She sees an Arab. It awakens some thoughts about differences. And then we have the statement that she heard about religion, but she never really did happen to have any. So our first reference to religion in Ida is a statement denying that she knows anything about it. In this day and age when the newspapers are rife with discussions about the liberal left and the religious right, it seems as though everyone has a choice and everyone has some kind of religious belief because we read about the argumentation in the newspapers. But you also read about the large numbers of people who either have no religious belief or don't attend services. And so we find that Ida is one of those transported beings who doesn't seem to have any religion. What does, however, what do religious impressions constitute for her? On page 18, she sees people sitting around a tree, people sitting and kneeling around trees who started moving their arms. She sees an evangelical meeting. She's walking along with her dog, and she sees people with their arms moving who could not stop their arms from going on moving. Ida stayed as long as she could, and then she went away. There are people who have various ways of looking at religion. I know of one person who said he used to go to church all the time. He would, as he listened to the evangelical words of his minister and had heard them repeated over and over and over again, his mind always wandered to the outdoors, where he began to think about the outdoors, and now he's a celebrated physicist. But he's not a religionist. So in some cases, people are turned on by religion, and in some cases, they're turned off. We find out that Ida purchases shoes before Easter. We find out that Bernard is a handyman. Chapter 2, page 25. I'm sorry, chapter 2, page 37. Bernard is a handyman who climbs on gates and goes on poles. And she remembers that Bernard was a saint. She knows of a mother. She knows that the mother of an uncle of hers spent time in church praying that her son's soul be saved. But let's turn to one episode that I'd like you to discuss. Turn to page, section 2, part 2, chapter 5, pages 127 to 128, all the way to the end of the book. And I'm going to read this episode to you, and you tell me what you think about it. There's a lot leading up to this, but I want you to think about it. She sees some dwarfs. She's dreaming of dwarfs. And the dwarfs said, "And of whom are you talking, all of you? We dwarfs, we are in the beginning. We have commenced everything, and we believe in everything. Yes, we do. We believe in the language of flowers, and we believe in lucky stones. We believe in peacock's feathers, and we believe in stars too. We believe in leaves of tea. We believe in a white horse and a red-headed girl. We believe in the moon. We believe in red in the sky. We believe in the barking of a dog. We believe in everything that is mortal and immortal. We even believe in spiders, in goldfish, and in the cuckoo. We, the dwarfs, we believe in it all and all, and all, and every one are alike. We are, all the world is like us, the dwarfs. All the world believes in everything, and we do too. And all the world believes in us and in you." Everybody in the room was quiet. And Andrew was really excited. And he looked at Ida, and that was that. Now, what do you think about that passage? Remember, we're focusing now on the concept of religion in this book, Ida. And I've just read a passage which I think has a religious moment. How would you assess that? Anything you say will be unique because no one has discussed this in any of the literature I've read. No critics will confute your discussion because no one has emphasized or spoken about this point. Yes, Ms.
I think initially she's talking about dwarfs. She doesn't believe in dwarfs, either male or female. Dwarfs are mythical creatures. She believes in a shoe on a table, which is something she can see and touch and feel.
Right. I think that's true. And yet she has seen these people waving their arms who are evangelical believers. And here we have a passage where she has dwarfs claiming that they have the Word, that they have words, that they believe in certain symbols, that they believe in certain images. You talk about a white horse. We believe in a white horse. In Houston this past weekend, there was a wedding, a Hindu wedding, and the groom, for at least half an hour, rode around on a white horse. So if these dwarfs believe in white horses, we know that the symbolism of marriage and strength and fecundity, perhaps in the Hindu faith in Houston, Texas, in 1995, will sustain the imagery of a white horse. And those of you who are Hindu can explain it more emphatically and more imagistically than I can. And the other interpretations of this passage. Mind you, your interpretation exists nowhere else. Right here. Ms. Corcoran is sitting there laughing and looking. Venture an answer, or venture a response. How about we believe in the barking of a dog, we believe in everything that is mortal and immortal? Why would you equate the barking of a dog with everything that is mortal or immortal? Or why would Gertrude Stein do it? Now, your guess is as good as mine. Press your handle so we can...
I really thought this whole passage had to do with superstitions and what superstitions they believe in. Like each one of those, I mean, you know, each one of the things, barking at the dog is supposed to mean something, howling at the moon, and, you know, even the shoe on the table. That's a superstition that some people believe that's bad luck. That's what I thought this whole passage, that even the dwarfs, which are supposed to be good luck and bad luck, believe in superstitions. And each one of these things are red-headed girl is supposed to be something.
Some people believe that some superstitions of some people are their religious beliefs and not the religious beliefs of others. There are people who practice religion in certain meaningful ways and practice rites that others consider superstitious. That is, we have to define what superstition is. But what is the barking of a dog? That came close to me because when my youngster was very young, one of my youngsters asked me if dogs have souls. I don't know if I've told you this. And I said, no, dogs don't have souls, only human beings have souls. And she became very, very disturbed about that. Very upset. Because she felt surely that if ever she were to go to heaven, she wanted her dog to be there too, and only souls go to heaven. She was very, very upset. So I really did some investigation and discovered that in Hebraic Kabbalah, there are 3 souls. There are human souls, there are vegetable souls, and there are animal souls. And I was able to tell her that her dog had an animal soul, and she was quite happy with that belief. And I should never have jumped to the conclusion that dogs don't have souls, because obviously I didn't know as much as I should have. Well, I'm not sure that Gertrude Stein knew Kabbalah. But we believe in the barking of a dog. We believe in everything that is mortal and immortal. And surely there is, not in superstition, but in religious belief, the realization that even the minutiae of animal life is part of creation. The barking of dogs has to be part of creation. Just as things mortal, we know, we like to think, are the images and pictures of creation. You may look upon this passage as being a series of superstitions. You may even look at this passage as being an example of Gertrude Stein mocking religion. But you can also look upon it as being a statement of efficacious religion, where you have the emotional and meaningful and creditable response of people who really believe in religion, who have faith, and who are conscious of the fact that everything they touch, everything they see, everything they imagine, and everything they feel has a religious, an implicit religious signification. Yes.
It has just occurred to me that the next to the last paragraph in this chapter could be taken as a parallel for the Apostles' Creed.
Which one? We're almost at the end, but tell me, and if we run out of tape, we'll continue this in the second session. Tell me that. Go on. Where?
The paragraph that begins, the dwarf said, we believe in peacocks and we believe in fleas and tea, we believe in it, because the Apostles' Creed is a statement of belief.
Speak it into the microphone so we get it on tape.
All of it.
Whatever you can repeat. Go on.
You remember me? I'm going to forget. Okay.
We believe in God, who has created and is creating, who has come in the true man Jesus to work in us and others by His Spirit
See, the Catholic one is
The
different.
Catholic one has a whole lot more of these.
We believe in God the Almighty. We believe in the seen. We believe in the
one Lord
Jesus Christ, who
The only begotten
Son, right?
born of God.
And then it goes on. We believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We believe in baptism for all forgiveness of sins and the resurrection of the dead.
All right. I think it's absolutely reasonable, if you were going to write about this passage, to demonstrate these analogies and to demonstrate that Gertrude Stein here is conceivably acknowledging, not ridiculing, belief. Thank you. We'll pick up in 10 minutes.